So one of the things we're going to be talking about today is the transition from leaded to an unleaded fuel. First thing I want to do, I want to thank EAA, Jack Pelton, and Rob Hackman for this wonderful event that we have here today. I want to thank James Viola with Gamma for offering us his pavilion for an hour. Thank you very much, Jim. So the first thing we have is, what is EAGLE? So the EAGLE is the private and public entity group who is shepherding the transition from leaded to unleaded fuel. As you can see from the logos up here, we really represent the entire cross-section of general aviation. Everything from the people who distribute the fuel, that make the fuel, that build the engines, and to operator organizations like AOPA or my organization, Vertical Aviation International. Our underlying goal, is which we've been given by Congress and the EPA and others, is by 2030, we want to have the transition underway and to successfully have identified one or maybe more candidates that could potentially be used as a replacement for 100 low lead. So how things will go today. Welcome and introduction. I'll stop talking here momentarily. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Caitlin Locke with the FAA and Kurt Castagna with the National Air Transportation Association. I'm so used to saying his acronym. And then we're going to call up two of our experts who are going to talk about some of the progress that has been made and some of the more technical aspects. And then what we'll do is we'll pull up our CEOs from the General Aviation Trade Associations to talk about how the transition to unleaded fuel is impacting their industry and what you can expect. At the end, I want to leave a few minutes for Q&A, so start getting your Qs ready. I will be walking around with a mic to get your questions. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Caitlin Locke with the Federal Aviation Administration and Kurt Castagna with NATA. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bailey, and thanks to the whole EAGLE team that's helped us put this event together and all the coordination. It's a ton of work, and they've done a great job. So good afternoon, or good morning, I should say. I'm Caitlin Locke. I'm the head of the FAA's Aircraft Certification Service, and I am co-chair of the EAGLE program alongside Kurt. So it's a privilege to be here at AirVenture with the entire community, everybody that has an interest in this particular discussion, so thanks for showing up today to listen to us. And we look forward to discussing the safe transition to unleaded gasoline for our GA piston fleet, the aircraft you fly. So as part of our presentation today, you're going to hear from Paul on the 3 unleaded fuel candidates, the status of the programs, GAMI, Swift, and Lyondell-Basel VP Racing. Also, I just want to, I think a question that's on a lot of your minds is we recently issued a special airworthiness information bulletin. So for any new technology as it enters the fleet, we want to have information coming in from the operators and from the community on any issues that they're seeing. So we encourage this SAIB as the means to report any instances of where you're seeing positive interactions with the fuel and where you might be seeing issues as well. So any report that we get of any negative interaction of the fuel with the aircraft, we investigate, the OEM investigates, and the fuel developer investigates as well. So as of right now, the FAA is investigating about 12 reports that we received, I think all from California. So if our investigation turns up any safety issues, then we would take the appropriate action to ensure that the community was aware of any corrective actions that would need to take place. But as of yet, we have not uncovered anything that requires immediate unsafe condition. So we're pleased, as many of you probably saw, that in May of 2024, Congress reinforced its commitment to EAGLE through the FAA's Reauthorization Act. So this legislation really underscores the collaboration that I think you're going to see here today to phase out unleaded fuels in a safe way, ensuring safety and efficiency across the entire fleet. Alaska, as we all know, has unique distribution challenges and has an extension until 2032. So the Act also reinforces the partnership across all the EAGLE members and the FAA's involvement in that effort, as we have a primary role in ensuring the safe transition. So approving the use of unleaded alternatives to leaded gasoline in all piston engines, we have full support for the fuels that are seeking authorization either through the fleet authorization or the traditional TC and STC paths. So both are viable alternatives, which is why we're investigating candidates on both paths. And you're going to see more of that in the presentation here that Paul's going to give in a few minutes. So really ensuring the availability of 100 low lead through this transition is also critically important, and I want to call your attention to the FAA's Office of Airports in May issued a Q&A document that answers a lot of questions that we've been getting from the community, and that clarifies Grant Assurance 40, which prohibits airports from restricting 100 low lead availability until the FAA indicates that there is an alternative fuel that meets the established criteria. And we have not yet identified a fuel that does meet the established criteria. So we're continuing our efforts to make sure that unleaded aviation gasoline is available for purchase and for use at early adopter airports as part of our national plan of integrated airport systems. And I think Paul's going to get into that as well. Finally, it's a big reauthorization provision, but one of the last provisions I wanted to mention was the nationwide transition plan to unleaded gasoline. So this is going to reflect all of the inputs that we get from everybody that has an interest in this. So not just pilots, but the operators, the fuel distributors, the developers, the maintainers, and of course the associations that have a primary role in ensuring communication and awareness of the issues to the FAA. So the plan, we hope to be able to release it later this year. And our goal is really to make sure that you all have an awareness of what is coming, what the relevant timelines are, what they are based on, and how we're going to move towards progress together in a way that is clear and is safe and as efficient as it can possibly be. So later in today's session, you're going to hear about our plans for the transition plan from Paul. And we really need your objective data and options on what we're going to present. So that's why we really want you to understand how we plan to approach this so that you have a voice in how it shapes up. So before we dive into the other updates that we're going to get from our presenters and the associations, I just want to make sure you're all aware of our website at flyEAGLE.org. That's going to have a lot of the information that we're presenting today and is a really good resource for all of you to engage with. So with that, I will pass the baton to my co-chair, Curtando.
Good morning. I'm NATA's president, Kurt Castagna. It's an honor to be here today serving our industry, and I want to thank you for being here and the attendance, really for us as a listening session to understand your perspectives in this transition. Our commitment is in a support for an unleaded future for general aviation. I want to thank Caitlin Locke from FAA and the organizational leadership in working with FAA from industry. Also want to thank the industry partners and other trade associations that you'll hear from in supporting our goal for the commitment to an unleaded future. In doing that, we want to make sure we preserve the piston aircraft fleet and this most important industry. As Caitlin mentioned, this year Eagle prioritized really communication measures, really led by Bailey. One of those measures was earlier in the year we did a listening session, Saturday morning coffee and wings, where we had over 1,600 participants and collected about 150 different questions, all of which come into the factor in which FAA is evaluating. So your feedback today is really important to us. We also, as she mentioned, took a contingency up to Alaska, and we went and visited the supply chain there to the many remote villages and saw the importance to the piston aircraft fleet and leaded fuel and those challenges and how we're going to manage the supply chain. And lastly, I would just say that you're going to hear the updates and the expertise from the technical expertise that I think will provide more clarity for this transition. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caitlin. I'd like to take a moment right now and call up our technical experts. We have Paul Rosinski also from the Federal Aviation Administration. So what makes a suitable replacement for 100 low lead? There's three aspects to it. We need something that's safe, we need something that's reliable, and we need something that's viable. Safety speaks for itself. The fuel has to work well in aircraft and keep the aircraft and its occupants safe. We need to make sure that it fits and it works. So let's go into the second part of that, viable. So what makes a viable replacement for 100 low lead? It's something that has to be able to work with the entire aviation fueling ecosystem. I've been interrupted by worse. So when we talk about viability, how does it work through the entire system? Can the distributors distribute it? Can the manufacturers? can the manufacturers, can the oil producers turn it into what we need it to do? Can it be stored safely? Can it be run through fuel trucks? Can it be stored in tanks? How long could it be stored? That's viability. The other aspect is this reliability. Reliability. How will it work in the actual planes? In today's world, the number of piston aircrafts and the combinations with airframes is immense. So we have to make sure whatever next fuel or fuels that kind of float to the surface are the ones that meet those three criteria. So right now, I'll turn it over to Paul. Thank you, Paul. Good luck.
Thanks, Bailey. As Bailey said, Yep, it's WRZESINSKI. So thanks. As Bailey said, I'm Paul Rzazinski. I'm the Senior Technical Specialist for Aviation Fuel at the FAA. I'm incredibly excited to be here at Oshkosh and for the opportunity to share with you some updates on the current status of unleaded fuels and the efforts going on that are focused on the development of the transition plan. So Caitlin talked to this a little bit, and we've talked to it in previous Eagle meetings, so I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but I did want to, again, kind of refresh the crowd. Right? We've got two different pathways for approval or authorization of unleaded fuels. Right? The first pathway, the Supplemental Type Certificate or STC pathway, is their traditional certification process. Right? And in this process, the applicant works with the FAA to provide data to show that the fuel will conform and work within the engine and hardware systems that they are targeting for use of the fuel. Currently, both Yami and Swift fuels have pursued and utilized STCs for the use of their fuel in aircraft in the fleet. The second process that we've looked at is the fleet authorization process. And this is an other than traditional means of authorization that comes as a result of the 2018 Authorization Act. In this process, there's a couple of different steps. There's a government industry partnership testing program that executes. The development of an ASTM specification, and then the FAA will then evaluate the data and authorize the fuel for use in various aircraft. Lyndell, Bezel, VP Racing are currently collaborating and are pursuing the fleet authorization process for the approval of their fuel. So I want to provide a short update on each of the fuels. So we'll start with GAMI. So GAMI's G100UL. Their fuel has two STCs. So that fuel, one STC covers the spark ignition piston engines in the fleet. The second STC covers the fixed wing aircraft in the fleet. They also have an ongoing process that's focusing on, an ongoing STC project where they are focusing on the rotorcraft airframes. The engines, right, have the approval through the engine STC. Currently, Vital Aviation has produced approximately 1.3 million gallons of that fuel, and that fuel is currently available at 5 different locations. So there's 2 locations in California, 1 in Mississippi, 1 in Texas, and in Ada, Oklahoma. So one thing that I would encourage all of you who are interested in this area is each of these fuel developers has a forum, and please attend that forum and hear the latest that the offers and developers have to present. So GAMI's forum will actually be Thursday morning here in this same location. So please consider attending that. Additionally, Swift Fuels is pursuing an STC with their 100R. They currently have an STC for the Cessna 172 and the Lycoming IO360. In addition to that, they have ongoing projects to expand that STC to applicable models for both engines and airplanes. And that work is underway and ongoing right now. They've also continued to deploy the 100R fuel to various flight schools. My understanding is also that the fuel has been deployed internationally as well. They're currently in the process of pursuing an ASTM production spec. So again, if you have the opportunity, Swift is actually hosting 2 forums. The first one will be just located It's going to be a long day if I have to compete with that all day. So the first forum is hosted just across the way, and it will actually follow this forum. And then there's a second forum Wednesday afternoon. And then, as we mentioned, right, Lyndell, and VP Racing, their collaboration is utilizing the fleet authorization pathway. And in this pathway, the testing for the fuel is being conducted under the PAFI program, which is a joint FAA industry initiative. And so I'm going to talk to the status of that on the following slides to provide a little bit more detail as to where we are in that process. Additionally, they're working with ASTM to obtain an initial test fuel specification, which will then be used to be further developed into a production specification. Lyndell is also hosting a forum. Again, this one's bright and early on Wednesday morning, and that will also be located on stage 11. So it's probably a little bit hard to see in the back, but what I've actually pulled up on the slide is information that's located on the Eagle website. So we've recently made significant updates to the Eagle. Significant updates to the Eagle website. And what we've done there is actually indicate the current status of the PAFI testing with effectively nearly real-time updates to that testing. So you can see there's a variety of test conditions and areas across here. So things that range from aircraft testing to materials compatibility to additional component testing. And what I really like about this presentation in this format is it does a couple of things. Is that highlights, right, that the solution for an unleaded fuel is a multi-dimensional challenge, right? We have to have a fuel that's compatible across the fleet with the various materials in the fleet. We have to have a fuel that will meet the engine performance parameters and other aircraft parameters. We have to have a fuel, right, that we can store, we can handle, and we can distribute. In some cases, right, those storage conditions are unique and pretty dynamic. And lastly, right, we're aware, right, that we also want a fuel that is not going to negatively impact human health or the environment, right? So all of these factors have to come together in order to develop a fuel that's a solution. And so if you get a chance, I would actually really encourage you to go to the Eagle website and look at this. It's kind of hard to see from here, but each one of these categories has a drop-down menu, and you can actually click on that menu and you can review. For example, in O-rings, you could review the material that was tested. You can, in some cases, even look at the material that was procured and where it was procured for that testing. So this testing really focuses, right, on critical areas. So there's perform engine testing across 6 critical engines. And it also brings into relationship, right, that OEM industry partnership with the FAA on this testing. So if you look through the materials testing, for example, you can see that there are several materials testing that are specific OEM materials and parts, right, that are being tested as part of this program. And this testing data, right, as we mentioned earlier, is part of the package that'll be utilized in the fleet authorization document. So we're anticipating that most of the testing, or nearly all of the testing, will be completed by September of 26. Once that testing data is complete, that data, along with an ASTM production specification and the FAA documentation for approval, will be used to generate the fleet authorization. And right now, we're anticipating to issue that fleet authorization in the spring of 2027. And again, this just really highlights the criticality of data collection and data gathering throughout the entire process. And that's something that will kind of be a theme as we move forward to other areas. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over and discuss a little bit about building towards the transition. So, right, there's several key critical factors that are driving the transition to unleaded fuels. We have the endangerment finding from the EPA, right, regarding human and public health impacts of leaded emissions. One of the other drivers is as of right now, there's a sole source provider for the tetralethyllead lead additive. That provider will not be able to provide that additive in perpetuity. So we really need to start to get in front of this and look at what the transition is. As Caitlin mentioned, right, Congress asked us in the 2024 Reauthorization Act to develop a transition plan in partnership with industry. And so that's one of the activities that is currently ongoing. So I'm going to bring this up and I'll kind of talk through the schedule a little bit. Right now, actually, the transition document is in the final stages of development. Once that document is done, our intent is to publish it and make it available to you, the stakeholders, so that you will have a chance to review and look at that document and provide input and comment on that document. We'll do that via the Federal Register. And again, we're trying to ensure, as Kurt mentioned, right, we're gathering your knowledge base, we're gathering your input, we're gathering the experience that you have in order to really design an effective transition. So as of now, we're anticipating the transition to proceed in 4 distinct phases as we move towards the 2030 and 2032 goals. And really, these goals are designed to effectively facilitate that transition. So the first phase, right, this is where we are at right now. This phase is focused on a couple of critical components, right? So we talked earlier about finalizing the approvals and the fleet authorization. So this first phase is finalizing the approvals and the fleet authorization to get the fuel available, to generate critical data to help inform stakeholders and to continue to support early adoption. We anticipate that this phase will continue until roughly spring of 2027, at which point we'll start to enter what we're considering a market experience phase. And so that market experience, that second phase is really focused on the gaining of market experience. And so what does that mean, right? That means we're distributing fuel to more locations, right? We maybe go from a single airport here and there to potentially regional distribution. We're maturing and developing the ways that we distribute and transport the fuel throughout the system. We're getting infrastructure in place to support the transition. We're also seeing fuel production volumes increase, right, to meet the demand of the fleet. There's a significant fuel demand for the fleet, and it can't just ramp up overnight. So we need to ramp that production up and increase the fuel available. And we expect to see expansion, right, beyond those early market adapters. In these 2 phases, right, these first 2 initial phases are really the key for what will initiate then as we move towards the national transition and make the fuel widely available and distributed throughout the fleet. And so that the success of those 2 the success of those 2 phases are what will sort of serve as the initiation point for that national transition, where we approach that 2030 timeline and goal of transitioning to unleaded fuels. So as the 4th phase will actually focus on the Alaskan transition, as Caitlin mentioned in reauthorization. Right, Alaska has 2 additional years in order to transition. But through stakeholder engagement, we've been able to learn a lot about the criticality and the interdependence that Alaska has on the supply from the lower 48. And so what does that mean, right? That means that actually we need to work with Alaska and shift that transition to be co-aligned in part with the national transition, because they can't get to the transition on their own from there. And that will help, it'll help speed the national transition along, but it will also help the Alaskan transition proceed to be able to make that 2030 deadline. And again, it just highlights another opportunity where that stakeholder engagement is incredibly viable in the process. And then lastly, right, obviously for this transition to be successful, we have to have good information sharing, right? We've got to be able to put information in the hands of the stakeholder community. And so that is a key tenet to this entire transition is developing the best practices, guidance, training, and strategies in order to effectively get the information to everybody, to the entire community throughout the entire process. So anticipate to see more to come. We're hoping to have this document available later this summer or early this fall, and we'll, again, really look for the feedback that you're able to provide. Caitlin also mentioned the Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, the SAIB. This is a great document. As she said, right, we've got new technology coming in, and the goal of this is to help facilitate that transition to unleaded fuels. Right, the primary goal of that is to enable collaboration to gather more data. So I'm not sure if any of you have had the chance to look through the document. I would highly encourage that you do that, because what we're actually really looking for is success stories, right? So if you've transitioned to unleaded fuels successfully, we want to know about it. If there's been issues, we also want to know about that, right? All of that data is input that can then be used to inform and generate improvements moving forward, and help us drive towards that successful transition. And as Caitlin mentioned, we've had roughly 30 submissions to the SAIB to date. Many of those are very successful transitions to unleaded fuels, and they span across a variety of fuels and aircraft. We do have some that have represented in-service issues, and again, those are being actively investigated and evaluated across the FAA. So again, I would encourage you to take part in the process and collaborate. So the email address is up here, the operational safety at FAA.gov, and the subject line, you just pop unleaded fuel in there, and there's, if you actually read through the SAB, there's some additional information that's really helpful to provide. So sort of in the theme of collecting data, we begin to understand that it's imperative to have data to make data to drive decision making. And so in discussions with you, the stakeholders, right, we've heard several areas of key interest where you're interested in understanding the variety of fuels. And if you start to think about that, those key areas actually really align with that multi-dimensional aspect, right? All of these things that the unleaded fuels need to do. And so we're looking to initiate a comparative testing program where we're going to focus sort of on 4 key areas. So the first one will be focused on the fit for purpose properties as well as the specification characteristics of the fuel, right? And then the second will focus on engine testing. So we're going to look to do both performance testing as well as some limited detonation testing utilizing critical engines. And again, right, this is driven as a result of those stakeholder collaborations and developing the data that's needed to help facilitate that transition forward. We're also going to execute a variety of tests on sort of key materials, right, that have been identified, as well as look at storage characteristics, because we want to, again, make sure that we're covering all of those aspects and all of these things that the fuels are required to do. And then lastly, right, we want to do some toxicology testing, again, right, to evaluate the risk to both workplace environment and exposure. So really the whole goal, right, is we are in this critical phase now, right? We are in this phase 1, we're gathering the data, we're generating the fuel approvals, and then we'll be able to use that data to drive forward to further the national transition plan. And so I think it's a great time. I think there's a lot of progress on the horizon, and I think with that, I'm going to move off the stage and turn it over to Walter.
All right. Try the remote. There we go. All right. So welcome, everybody. My name is Walter DeRozier with General Aviation Manufacturers Association. I head up our airworthiness and certification and continuing airworthiness activities in coordination with the GAMA members and the manufacturers and supporting the broader initiatives, initially with the testing program under the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, and then as that got expanded into EAGLE in terms of enabling and facilitating a transition. So as part of that, I was going to just highlight kind of the scope of EAGLE. Takes a look at the entire process and the entire cycle of what it takes to get a viable fuel out there as a replacement. So a lot of the discussion to date has historically been on the fuels themselves. Obviously the most important in terms of safety and taking a look at the different pathways that were mentioned earlier about whether you pursue the PAFI testing, which is the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, and the fleet authorization are kind of the green boxes at the top, or the fuel can be developed and go through traditional FAA type certification, STC or type certificate, amended type certificate, which are the green boxes at the bottom. But ultimately, the goal for a successful, viable fuel is something that can be deployed out into the infrastructure and into the system and get to you, end users, at the airports where they're needed in a way that it's going to be available to you and supported by all the different stakeholders. And so that's kind of the blue bar down the middle of producers, distributors, FBOs, and then ultimately the owner-operators. And as part of that process, you get the support from the data and the technical data, which is the fleet authorization and the STCs, to be able to support that. What I wanted to focus a little bit on is those little purple boxes. So the little purple boxes we talked about, what if there are some impacts? How do we help mitigate some of those impacts? And that's one of the key things in terms of EAGLE recognized when it was established. It's not just the FAA certification and the approval from the safety perspective for the development of the fuel itself, but also identify in the event that there are impacts and understanding where they are and then doing some research and support of some technical solutions to mitigate some of those potential impacts on the existing GA fleet if we're going to have a transition to a complete replacement fuel. So in that area, I was going to talk a little bit about our approach in terms of Eagle establishing what we call R&D areas of activity. It starts with identifying where those areas of impact are. So on the slide, what I have are two areas that we know, based on the fuels that we're looking at, based on the fuels that were discussed earlier, are the potential areas of impact. One of them is the octane and detonation protection performance. We know replacing the tetraethyl lead with alternate means of achieving the octane detonation protection using different means. Lead has been a really, really good component in terms of octane protection, detonation protection, and increasing octane. None of the unleaded fuels are going to have the same level of detonation margin in terms of octane protection as good as what we see with tetraethyl lead. So 100 low lead or fuel, on average, most of the fuel out there actually has like 102 motor octane number, MON octane protection or detonation protection performance levels. None of the unleaded fuels are going to be quite that high in terms of normal performance, but all of them are reaching numbers that are at or very close to 100. So what does that mean? In terms of the development of our best practices, a lot of the experience with all the testing out there in the field, PAFI has published on the flyEAGLE.org website some of the PAFI lessons learned from previous years of testing different fuels, all of the testing that's done in different engines. They've identified the critical worst case engines for detonation testing, the Lycoming IO540K and the TIO 540J. Both have models that have been identified as critical worst case. They've both been published in our lessons learned on the PAFI website. With that is based on the methodology that has been used historically for detonation testing and measurement, the FAA Advisory Circular 33.47 and the ASTM methods shown on the screen here. So there's an area we know with less margin. What does that mean for the existing fleet? There might be potential impact. Some of the testing has identified certain make model engines with potential impact. And so those are one of the areas that we're looking at in terms of how do we help mitigate those areas of impact for those folks who have those particular make models. The other area that we've seen is materials compatibility. A lot of these unleaded fuels have new components in the fuel, different types of constituents, different types of chemicals, and we have a very, very broad fleet of historic aircraft with many materials over decades and decades of experience. And so in those areas, there's a potential of impact in materials compatibility. So one of the things that the PAFI best practices and the work that came in from the technical experts across a broad range of stakeholders was to identify a materials compatibility test plan and a test matrix. It's published on the flyEAGLE.org website. It identifies a very broad range of materials representing not only the engine and aircraft fleet, but also representing the production and distribution infrastructure and the systems that deploy those fuels. And then based on that, we've also got some field experience. Some of those are areas related to, for example, paint, some of the fuel tank sealants, some O-rings, aged bladders and patches, and some of the legacy fleet and how old some of those materials are. So recognizing that we're seeing some of that, Paul had mentioned the SAIB was intended to collect that information, collect that feedback for those folks that have some initial experiences. And that adds to the testing data that's being collected with all these different fuels and being tested in terms of understanding those impacts. So in those areas, part of the R&D activities that Eagle is supporting right now, one is in the area of detonation. I talked about the detonation methodology, the AC, that we've been using for decades and decades. There's an opportunity to learn more in terms of current technology and the capability to look at those test methods. Understanding of unleaded MON benefits might be a little bit different than a leaded fuel MON benefit in terms of detonation protection. How we measure and monitor the engine performance and the onset of detonation and the degree of detonation are all areas to better understand and maybe help identify approaches to mitigate some of those impacts that we're seeing or differences that we're seeing. In other cases where there might need to be some kind of mitigation implemented, we're looking at changes to operational procedures such as ignition timing, maximum manifold and cylinder temps, or different approaches that you might be able to look at mitigating it that way. Other ways, if it needs more, could be potential engine modifications if it might be necessary, such as electronic ignition or even looking at compression ratios. And as I mentioned, these are in areas where it might be proven necessary to maintain the appropriate level of safety and the safety margins for some of the existing engines and aircraft that might be impacted. The area of materials compatibility. We're taking a look at, Paul mentioned the comparative testing is going to inform a lot of that in addition to the individual testing that's being done by all the fuel developers. And then the identification of some mitigations. There can be practices, there can be coatings, there can be replacement materials. So the idea is, how do we as Eagle help collect that understanding of impact, identify potential mitigations, and then what's the means or mechanism by which it can be made available or deployed for those of you that might need some of those in terms of supporting a future transition as part of that transition plan. And so those will all be considered in that transition plan, understanding impacts, understanding what it takes to get mitigations out there, and being part of the process of helping enable and facilitate that to be made available. As we collect more of that data, as we understand more of those impacts, we have a lot of experience and successes in the past in the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, which is the fuels testing program, where we brought together the subject matter expertise of a lot of the stakeholders directly involved in the testing program, and bringing in their expertise in terms of developing some of our test methods and evaluating some of the criteria to adequately assess a new fuel to an existing fleet. We're looking at a similar approach in these areas of mitigations. We will put out a call for inviting stakeholders similar to those that we have in PAFI as the Technical Advisor Committee that'll look specifically at potential areas of impact, specifically at some of the potential mitigations and how to help support the deployment of those mitigations. And so that'll be a cross-section of stakeholders with an interest and expertise to be able to support that. So with that, we were going to transition a little bit to the next part of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Walter. Now I'd like to take a moment and call General... Could I call the CEOs to the stage, please? So now we have an opportunity to hear from the individuals where the rubber meets the road. These are the individuals that represent general aviation across the board. To Kurt's left, we have Darren Pleasance with the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. We have James Viola, General Aviation Manufacturers Association, and Ed Bolin with National Business Aviation Association. Darren?
Is that on? Can you hear me? You can. As I've taken this role, I've been now 7 months, and I've done several of these types of forums. I think the pretty consistent message I get back is often, why are we even going through this? There's not that much lead in 100 low lead. It sure feels like a lot of work for a problem that doesn't exist. And I think there are multiple reasons, some of which have been mentioned already, but at the end of the day, zero amount of lead is the right amount of lead, if you listen to the APA. Probably perhaps even more importantly is the point that was made earlier is we do have one sole source provider of tetraethyl lead in the world, and that's Innospec over in the UK. They've already indicated their intention of getting out of that business. They would like to be out of the lead producing business. They've been doing it for decades. They've supported the fuel forever. But if they look forward, they are very much of the view that we will eventually transition into an unleaded fuel future. And so they need to begin years in advance managing that mitigation process. So there's no indication that I've heard, at least, that they're doing anything before 2030. But they don't intend to be in that business much beyond that. So that, to me, puts a lot of pressure on us to make sure that we're very proactive in this journey. And the good news is we do have 3 fuel providers who are well along that way. And to the extent we can actually get to a good outcome, I think it's personally good for the industry. I fly an engine that works better, a Rotax engine works better on unleaded fuel. So I'm, as an operator of an aircraft, I am very bullish on the benefits that we'll all receive when we get there. But I am concerned about any direction that has us sticking with 100 low lead, in particular because of this dependency on one single provider of the material that puts lead into the fuel. So, starting comment.
All right, well, thank you. It's good to see a full house here at Oshkosh on day one. I also fly a helicopter and an airplane, both with 100 low lead right now, so we're concerned about that transition. We all are on board that, yes, we must get out of the lead business, and so we're doing that, representing the manufacturers and suppliers, We know that technology, as we advanced, we will, solve this issue. We'll solve this issue with all the stuff that was presented today, with a comparison of the different opportunities for the fuel that's being developed. Also, we've got manufacturers out there that are taking it on themselves of how do you make engines that run on the future fuels, that run on diesel, that are able to now get smaller, get into the cowls of the future aircraft. So we're not only trying to solve it with the fuel issue, which Eagle and the partnership with FAA is working extremely hard on for some of the results you'll see that Paul presented next summer, but we're also looking at technology for new engines as well. So over to Ed.
Well, thank you, Jim, and welcome everybody. Ed Bolin with the National Business Aviation Association. I suspect all of you know that across the United States, there are thousands of companies and individuals that are using general aviation aircraft in the pursuit of a business. So we all know general aviation is the foundation of aviation. It is where the airports are, it is where the pilots are, it's the first foundation where people train. And so certainly the future of piston aircraft in the United States is fundamental to everybody in aviation. I think a lot has already been said about the challenges to the future. The lead producer has indicated they won't be around. We know the EPA has made their statement, but we know we need to make sure that we can have aircraft able to operate safely and efficiently throughout over 5,000 public use aircraft in the United States. So we recognize that this is a journey. It is something that has had our full attention for some time. We do have important lessons learned. We do have hope for the future with some of the companies that have been discussed. And we do think we've got to be together, talking, listening, hearing each other as we go through this important effort to make sure we can have a vibrant general aviation industry, including some of the high-performance singles and twins, to make sure that we have a foundation for the future so we can keep coming to Oshkosh and celebrating this healthy, growing industry for many years to come.
On behalf of NATA, so our members represent the FBO, fuel distributors, and small general aviation airports. And to that end, we're very focused on a strict peer review testing process that the FAA is following. Traditionally, our members and fuel suppliers who are selling you the fuel at the pump have relied on an ASTM specification. NATA has taken the position early on that ASTM specification was critical to this process to protect the integrity of the distribution through the materials compatibility chain all the way from the refiner to the wing of the airplane. Recent findings in California, if you followed, where there was a pursuit by environmentalists to expedite the transition to an unleaded fuel or to ban the leaded fuel in California in advance of the federal reauthorization language. And the findings of the court in California were to support basically the reauthorization protections where there was not a viable product yet in the marketplace commercially available, and they recognized the challenges with the materials compatibility piece. Lastly, the perspective that we're seeing with some of the results of material compatibility testing from candidate fuels is showing that there is further testing required. I think that's why the FAA hasn't made a determination yet on one single fuel. They continue to do that. But from our perspective, from the FBOs and the fuel distributors, we're relying on the testing that's being done by the engine manufacturers who tell us that ASTM testing or ASTM specification is critical to this process.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much. Now we get the opportunity to turn it over to you. So please raise your hand. I'll come back to you with the mic. So if you have any questions, I will start over here. But let me start with one question, and I'll open it up to anybody. Tell me what happens in December 2030. Paul?
Yeah, so right as we've talked about, right, December 2030 is the goal for that transition to unleaded fuel. And as we're building through the transition plan, right, we're going to add more detail to what are the steps that are going to take to get there and the pathways and the road to get there. So the goal is to really continue to push to drive towards that 2030, knowing that it's a goal. If there looks like there's going to be road bumps or speed bumps along the way, right, those are things that we can go back and we can get additional input and guidance on and how to move forward on those things.
Next question.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dave Nelson from Rochester, Minnesota. And first of all, thank you for everything you're doing. It's going to be very important to the entire fleet. My question to you is this. During the transition phase in particular, if I load up with fuel A at airport A and then fly to fuel or airport B and try to put fuel B into it, I'm going to have a mix. So what is Eagle doing to test for mixing between the various fuels?
Yeah, so right now, right, the fuel approvals indicate the miscibility of the fuels that they're approved to mix with. So the specification or the fuel data will tell you which are the approved fuels to mix with. Right, obviously the situation you're talking about is one that's not desirable. We are looking at potential paths forward to be able to do some testing on fuel miscibility, and that is potentially pending work to come. But in the meantime, right, the fuels will be approved and they will include limitations to what they're able to be blended with. Yes, and they're all miscible with 100 low lead.
All right, next question.
Hi, yeah, Will Geisbon at the Air Current. So you were talking a little bit about the FAA choosing one fuel. My understanding that that is not your intent, and you talked a little bit about grant assurances. So could you kind of walk through the process of how you're determining if a fuel meets these requirements related specifically to the grant assurance piece? That'd be great.
So yeah, the FAA is not choosing one fuel. There are multiple pathways that a fuel provider can choose, either the fleet authorization, which is the testing program through PAFI, or the STC-TC route, where it would be an independent specification. So as long as the fuels meet the requirements, then it would be an acceptable candidate. As of yet, no fuel does meet all of the requirements. So do you want to speak to more specifics on the requirements?
And then in terms of your question talks about the grant assurance. So the grant assurance is a little bit different than just the FAA's safety approval through either fleet authorization or STC or type certification. And so there's criteria that are in the legislation that the FAA has to look at. The Office of Airports is the one that is looking at grant assurances and how that's applied. They've actually published an FAQ document related to that assurance, so they've got additional information that's available out there, but it talks about being available, and there's many different aspects that can be considered as part of that. So I would defer to the FAQ document and how they're looking at that in terms of when the fuel is out in the market and when it's readily available, when does it meet those criteria and thresholds for the grant assurance purposes.
One thing to recognize, the transition plan that they're going to work on, the 2030 deadline protects us through December 2030 for the grant obligations. If for some reason we did not have an acceptable fuel by that time, we would very well as industry looking to extend those grant obligations, which sunset at that point.
All right, over here on your right.
Hi, Dan Olson from Fort Collins, Colorado. Two of the fuels are going through the STC process, yet many of us here fly experimental aircraft. What is the guidance for being able to utilize this fuel for experimentals?
So one of our partners, obviously, in this program is EAA, who isn't here with us on the stage, but that's a big part of the discussion of the transition plan, is also to identify and recognize how does information get available to be used to support portions of the fleet that are not addressed by an FAA approval. And so there is going to have to be some level of information and coordination being provided as part of that. So in the STC process, the fuel developers are the ones who own and have their data and information. And so they all work in ways on how they're going to make that information available and to support that in terms of how that can be used by owner-operators who have experimental aircraft. Because ultimately it's the owner-operators of those aircraft responsible for looking at the data, determining appropriateness for their use and the safety of their use and their product. As part of the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative and under the fleet authorization, that does get included as part of the FAA's issuance of the authorization. Will also be a package of data to support that as well. So those are all being considered regardless what method is being approved on the fuel. It's just making sure that we recognize there are large portions of the fleet that need additional information so that they can support their decisions on the appropriateness of using it in those products.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of harmonize on what Walter said, right? If you're looking at the STC route, reach out to the STC producer, right? Look for the data that you need to be able to help you facilitate your decision making. And you'll have a great opportunity, right, to potentially do that at the forums throughout the week.
Hello, my name is Patrick Cabral, Tacoma, Washington. You've identified the worst engines, but those engines are high horsepower and burn a lot more fuel than my 0300. I'm not the squeaky wheel, but I can't give you any data because I can't get fuel from where I am to. So my question for my Cessna 170 using the GAMI GA100 USDC, what is the timeline? Is the timeline being met? Are we behind or are we ahead?
Yeah, so, right, that's, as we talked about, right, we're in that critical phase 1 of that transition plan right now. We're trying to get the fuels approved, we're trying to get them authorized, we're getting out the fuels out to early adopters, right, to locations that have that. As we move into that phase 2, right, that's when hopefully you're gonna start to see that fuel available where you're at. You're gonna start to have opportunities to do that. Those opportunities should increase as we move in that phase 2 experience. I think it's really hard to say are we ahead or behind because we don't have all the data yet, right? We're still getting approvals and authorizations and we're still generating that data. Once we've got that data, then we can make decisions, right? I'm a huge proponent of data-driven decisions. So let's get data and let's use that to make our decisions.
Rex Slingerland, Grand Haven, Michigan. I'm from a small airport. We have 2 tanks. One has Jet A, one has 100 low lead. What's going to help them so that they can make that transition before it's 2030? You know, so because they would like to try it, but they don't have the infrastructure to put in, you know, another pumping system and something like that.
One thing you might try is that going to your fuel supplier who supplies that field, and would they be willing to make the infrastructure requirements? I know if you talk to as well the candidate fuels, would they be willing to assist you with a program to bring in a temporary tank or portable tank during the transition period? And they are working with various airports to do that.
Resources that will be available through the Office of Airports. So I would encourage your airport to actually reach out to the FAA's Office of Airports and look at, there are potentially opportunities available to support infrastructure procurement to potentially help facilitate, right, an additional tankage or temporary storage or other means to potentially bring a fuel into your location.
Hi guys, Don Thompson, Long Beach, California. I'm interested in knowing what you're going to do to protect the fuel supply if this doesn't all come into fruition by 2030.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, so currently, right, we talked about the grant assurance is going to maintain that 100 low lead is available through the transition. So that will take you to the 2030 date. Obviously, as we collect data, as we move forward, that is something that, right, will need to continue to be monitored and evaluated. We've engaged with InnoSpec, the tetraethyl lead producer, and they don't want to turn off the supply and put everybody out, right, without an acceptable solution. So the conversations are happening and people are working, right, again, to get that data, to figure out what the path forward is and make sure that the right pieces are aligned in the right schedule in order to make sure that that happens.
All right, over here on our left. Oh, sorry, Walter, go ahead.
I was just going to, in terms of clarifying, there's no definitive drop dead activity in 2030 in terms of it's the goal and the objective. The protection for 100 low lead is out to 2030, but there's nothing that bans the continued use of 100 low lead. And so that's why we look at it as an important milestone and goal and objective for all of us. And the transition plan, all those information that will help inform that transition plan will then inform what that actual timeline is. Now, a big part of that is some potential rulemaking that continues to follow on from the actions the EPA already took. A big part of collecting this information to understand the status of the fuels, to understand the viability of the fuels, is to inform that rulemaking, to help make sure that there's not a premature banning of any kind of 100 low lead that the entire fleet can use safely today until we know there's something that we have to transition to, and then a transition plan to help a smooth transition mitigate impacts.
All right, thank you, Walter. Over here on your left.
Hey, I am Thomas Harrison from Oklahoma City. I'm attending the University of Oklahoma. I had two quick questions. One, what is the projected cost of the unleaded fuels compared to 100 low lead? And my second question, you mentioned the worst case engines. Which engines, if you don't mind me asking, did the unleaded fuels run best in?
I'll address the pricing piece. I mean, obviously, with the limited supply in the marketplace today, is driving the price. And I think as you see more volume coming to the market and more fuel coming on board towards the transition plan, you'll start to see economies of scale that way. But today, there is a price differential between the current 100 low lead and the unleaded fuels.
Once it's like fully integrated, do you expect it to be around the same?
Well, I can't make that decision because obviously that's a consumer, that's a price driven, by the marketplace, but we would hope that would be the case. Can you ask your second question again?
My second question was which engines, was it performing best in?
Best.
So it performs adequately for all the engines we're being tested in. What we're looking for is any potential impact of engines that it does not perform at the necessary and appropriate level. But all other engines, the whole idea is we're kind of looking at a matrix, we call it enveloping, looking at the criteria and trying to identify based on a certain number of engines that we test, we have confidence and understanding that it's going to be safe to operate adequately with all the other engines within that envelope.
Only thing I would add is on that second part of the question is, as I mentioned earlier, unleaded fuel actually runs quite well in the engines, and the detonation work that was talked about, and the materials compatibility, obviously those have to get resolved. But assuming those get resolved, all the other aspects of unleaded fuel have been quite positive. If you think of, we ran it in our Baron, and we had much lower wear metals in the oil, meaning that basically the engine is wearing out less quickly in a sense in unleaded fuels. Rotax engine runs great on that as well. So for those of us who fly 100 low lead airplanes, we always deal with fouled spark plugs. The oil's quite dirty. A Rotax is 100 hours between oil changes if you run unleaded, 25 if you run 100 low lead. So there's a lot of benefits from what I've seen personally to an unleaded fuel. It's just obviously detonation materials compatibility are the two main areas that we have to make sure that we're not asking all of you to become test pilots around those. That's why this group and the people behind it are helping to drive those tests.
Thank you, Darren. Any other questions? I'll come to you. Excuse me, sir. Hi, I'll hold on to the mic. Name and thing. What's your question?
About federal programs being terminated over the last 6 months. John Whittier, St. Louis, Missouri. Over the past 6 months, many federal programs that had previously been authorized and funded are now being terminated or at least paused. Will Eagle initiative be affected by that? And if not, why not?
So Congress made their intent very clear that we need to develop a transition plan and support that transition in an orderly way. So I don't see the FAA's role in Eagle changing. I think we just reauthorized, yes, in 2024, and we've heard no indication that there's any administration changes in that regard as well.
All right, any other questions? What? Excuse me. Okay, hold on.
UL-94.
Name,
Okay. Hi, Chuck Irwin, Morristown, New Jersey. So the question is, I guess, is a question for the board, and am I allowed to ask a question for the crowd?
Let's just stick to them for
Okay, so we'll stick with the board. So given that UL-94 is out there in the market and it's not readily available so that everyone here can use it, would the federal government have any mechanism to do like you're talking about, where you have assistance for the FBOs to add in additional tankage to make UL-94 more prolific, as a way of Part of the phasing process you were talking about was, you have a long road to build of all these things to get all this UL90, UL100 out there. Why not let UL94, which is here now, let it build the road, and then when UL100 is ready, it just rides the road and it's much faster deployment.
So, as was mentioned before, I think you're having your airport speak to the Office of Airports of potential grant funding opportunities where they could use that those resources to help put infrastructure in for the unleaded fuel tank. At the same time, you might check with your states. Certain states and localities have created their own incentive programs to not only pay for the STCs, but to actually price match the fuel on par with 100 low lead to incentivize its use. And so local airports are doing that. They're creating that mostly because those communities are looking for an unleaded transition sooner. But you're also seeing states that are allocating state grants and funds to help put the infrastructure in. Yeah, you could use AIP funding grants for the tank infrastructure, but the airport itself could work and create their own financial mechanism to incentivize the sale to address the pricing piece while we go through the transition.
Sir, any other questions? All right, I think we'll wrap up with this question, if that's all right with the panel.
Raymond Chase, Bob Barrow, Cincinnati, Ohio. One of the three fuel providers does not have an ASTM fuels. They're not going after that. And I'm just curious, does that not ineffectively invalidate them from this process, even though you've said it's very critical that everybody has, or all the manufacturers have a ASTM spec? Just curious.
Thank you.
Yes. So via policy, right, we allow both an industry consensus specification and an independent specification. So both are acceptable solutions provided, right, that industry consensus specification is at the same level and rigidity and meets the requirements to be equivalent to an industry consensus specification.
The ASTM process is the consensus process that's been used historically for fuel, and so it's not required for the FAA certification approval. It is the traditional means on how the other stakeholders involved in making those business decisions, those investments, the liability assessment, the risk assessment in terms of producing, distributing, dispensing, supporting the use of the fuel. Speaking on behalf of the Gamma members as manufacturers, traditionally that's the opportunity to learn and understand the fuel, to make business decisions in terms of how manufacturers would support the use of a new fuel, how they might respond to customers, how they might provide customers with continued airworthiness support or warranty support. So it's just a mechanism for getting that information and that knowledge and that understanding out to a broader community of stakeholders involved in helping facilitate the deployment and the use of a fuel. So if you don't get an ASTM spec, then other ways, how does that information get out there? So I think traditionally it's always been an ASTM spec. We know the other fuels are continuing down that traditional path, but there's other ways of doing that. And so we look forward to continuing as stakeholders to be able to engage in that.
From the sales and distribution side at the airport level, they traditionally have relied on an ASTM specification, and it's not a guarantee that the fuel is going to meet the detonation or issues, but it does provide a level of stability to what that spec is across multiple users or across the chain. As Walter mentioned, though, it's not required by the FAA process to have an ASTM. It's voluntary. So 2 of the products are going through ASTM certification. 1 has chosen not to. They're not required to. But I would say that from the folks that are selling you the fuel at the airport level or FBO, they're looking at it, does the OEMs, does Walter's members at Continental and Lycoming, do they require a ASTM certification? So it's challenging to have an FBO sell the fuel when the engine company itself is not accepting the fuel without an ASTM.
All right, great. Thank you all very much, and more importantly, thank you all very much for joining us today. If you have any other questions, most of us will be around. On behalf of the Eagle Initiative, we do have some flyers and some business cards. If you have an opportunity for more information, or you want to look up some specific data that we might have available, visit flyEAGLE.org. Thank you very much, and enjoy Oshkosh.